Hello everyone, welcome to the first video on our advanced GIS methods training, this time looking at internet user classification and k-means clustering. So I'm Dr. Nick Bierman and I'll be taking you through the session today. I'm also joined by Dr. Jacob McDonald. Jacob, could you introduce yourself please?
Hi, so I am Jacob McDonald. I'm a research data scientist with the CDRC based at the University of Liverpool.
Wonderful, great. And thanks very much for joining us today, Jacob.
And thanks for having me.
So we're going to talk a little bit about geodemographics in general, just to give a quick background of what they are. And then we're going to dive into the internet user classification and the retail center typologies. So these are two geodemographic style classifications that we've created at the CDRC and we'll be looking at in this session. We're also going to say a little bit about limitations as well. So both of the internet user classification and the retail center typology, they're both geodemographic classifications developed using the k-means clustering method. The second part of the video will talk more about k-means clustering, so do please check that out in due course. We use the term geodemographic. Internet user classification is definitely a geodemographic because it's the demographics of people and where they live. Retail center typology is not really a geodemographic because there's no demography as such, because we're classifying retail centers rather than people, but the same principles apply. Each of these so the internet user classification, it's got 10 main clusters and it's looking at how the internet is used and what internet infrastructure is available. And then the retail center typology, it's a hierarchical classification. So we have 5 top level clusters and then 15 clusters beneath those. And I'll say a little bit more about that when we get to that stage. So k-means is a method that's frequently used in geodemographics to actually create the clustering, the classifications. So what are geodemographics? It's the grouping of people, which is the demographics bit, usually by where they live. So that's where the geo comes in. And we use this process to identify similar neighborhoods. And the similar can apply to a range of different things. And the principle has been around for quite a long time. Charles Booth's credited with developing the first kind of geodemographic, although he didn't use the term at that point. He was a shipping business owner and philanthropist in London, lived between 1840 and 1916. And he was really interested in the people of London and what they did and all that kind of stuff. And he put together this survey, Life and Labour of the People in London, between the 18 and 1900s. And so he took a very quantitative and a qualitative approach to try and classify and group the people of London and be able to talk about them. He was very interested in the qualitative side of things as well as the quantitative. So his data collection was walking around certain areas with people who knew that area. So this is one of his notes from his data collection diary. And he took a walk around this particular area with the local police constable, Robert Turner. And so that he's got notes about what the local area is like, who the people are that live there, what to do, all those kinds of bits of information. And he did that for the whole of London and kind of collated this into these kind of 7 different groups and created this map. This map's a fantastic visualization, and if you're interested in this sort of thing, I'd recommend having a look at it. And so he came up with these 7 groups, all the way from kind of using colours black, which he described as lowest class and vicious semi-criminal, all the way through kind of chronic want, poor, mixed, fairly comfortable, all the way up to upper middle class and upper classes, he described as wealthy. And he used this colour scheme on the map to show the differences. And we can see from the map here, there's a bit of St Pancras, but there's areas of London where the very wealthy live maybe 2 or 3 streets away from the very poor. And that's not really changed that much. It's still the case in London. You can walk 10 minutes and be in a very prosperous neighbourhood in one area and a very poor neighbourhood in another area. So it was kind of more formally developed in the 1970s, and it was originally used by the government to target urban deprivation funding. So the question was, we've got these funds for development, where can we target these to have the most impact? And then it also got picked up in the commercial sector. And so there's a couple of companies who create commercial geodemographic classifications. So CACI created a classification called Acorn, and Experian created a classification called Mosaic to target commercial sales, essentially. So from the kind of mail out shots in the late 90s to junk mail today, they use the geodemographics to target these mail shots. And they all have a kind of similar type of structure. So you have some top level clusters, and then you have some subclusters within them. And you have a kind of hierarchical arrangement. And each cluster, there's some information about the kind of typical consumer that is in that cluster. And so it'll tell you what newspapers they read, what they tend to buy, do they tend to go shopping at Waitrose or Tesco's, what sort of clothes do they buy, and so on. More recently, we have the development of the output area classification using the 2011 census. And this was one of the first open geodemographic classifications. So it's a completely open process. There are journal papers about how it was put together, and all the data was census data. And this is what the classification looks like. We have it on the CDRC site, and we have these 8 kind of top level groups. So we have and they all have names, so like cosmopolitans or suburbanites or hard-pressed living or ethnicity central. This is an example from Liverpool, and you can see we have different regions where the different clusters tend to occur. So that's the kind of general approach to geodemographics. So we're going to dive a little bit more into the internet user classification initially. So we've got a couple of examples here looking at Liverpool and London. And so, Jacob, could you tell us a little bit more about the internet user classification, please?
So what the internet user classification is, it's generally a clustering that looks to explore how people interact with the internet and kind of combine that along with local infrastructure, internet infrastructure. So we really want to kind of combine a multitude of different variables, capturing not only kind of the geodemographic and the demographic components, but also the kind of accessibility, the infrastructure, the type of internet accessibility that they have arranged to. And then using this, we're going to be able to profile different areas across the UK based on, commonalities and similarities in how the users, the resident of that area are going to kind of interact with the internet.
Okay, great. So we have a kind of range of data that goes into this. Could you take us through those, please?
So we want to make sure that we're kind of looking at clusters based on multitude of different variables, right? So we don't want to be just looking at one specific variable. We're interested in kind of how the combination of these variables define the kind of interaction and the local context of internet use. So what we're going to do is mainly look at 2 domains of data. The first being kind of more demographic in nature, which is the British Population Survey. So for every area, which is in our case, the LSOA geographic unit. So for each of these areas, what we're going to want to know is how do different kind of segments of the population interact with the internet. So using the survey results that we have, we know the kind of prevalence of internet use at home. We know the type of computers that the respondents have on average for that area. We have kind of the frequency and the type, why they're using internet. So we'll be able to tell whether it's primarily going to be those that are working from home, using it, frequently for kind of accessing the internet, or whether it's more kind of an older population using online shopping, or for a completely different aspect. So that's going to come from the British Population Survey. And then we're going to be kind of merging that with a number of other data sources. So we use some kind of transactional data and internet speed kind of to proxy the infrastructure of the local area. So again, all of these inputs are going to be kind of scaled to the same geographic area, so the LSOA. And then for every LSOA, we're going to be able to kind of define the demographic aspect, but also the infrastructure aspect of internet use and cluster based on these.
Okay, great. Okay, thanks for that. So we ended up with 10 clusters for the internet user classification, and we picked out a couple of examples. Could you kind of explain how they're a bit different?
So what we get from the internet user classification is 10 unique clusters. So every one of our observational units will be assigned to a specific cluster. And then these clusters are all going to have a kind of range of underlying data that is making up that cluster. So all of these input data that I just previously spoke about from the British Population Survey and the local infrastructure, every one of these clusters is going to have a unique signature when it comes to the dynamics of every one of these input variables. So what we can do after the fact, after we get our cluster output, is to look at what it is about these cluster groups, and specifically what it is about the types of inputs that are going into this cluster group. So on the right-hand side here, you'll see the 10 different output cluster groups that we have. And then in that bar chart there that we have on the left side, those would be a selection of the input variables that are going into defining that group. So here, for example, we have the first group, which is e-cultural creators. So this would be the average underlying signature for all of the LSOAs in the e-cultural creator group based on the types of input data that we use. So you can see on the bottom axes there, we have some of the input data from the British Population Survey. So, you know, own desktop, own laptop. So what, for example, here we can see with cultural creators, on a whole, that cluster group is much more prevalent to have their own laptop relative than their own desktop PC. So these are the types of kind of dynamics that we're going to be able to look at using the input data and then the output clusters.
Okay, great, thank you. And you know, I've picked out another example. So this is group 7, which is the passive and uncommitted users.
Right.
If we compare the graphs, you can see they look quite different at first glance. And then if we dive in a bit more, we can see some of the differences there.
Exactly. So this really highlights nicely the different types of signatures that different clusters are giving out. So we're not just looking at one specific variable, but we're looking at the combination of all these input variables. And then looking at these patterns, you can really tell that, you know, group 7, which are clearly not, you know, as active with internet use on any of the scores, any of the input variables. How do they differ from the e-cultural creators?
Okay, yeah. And in here we can see in the kind of internet history group, probably the two highest values across the whole for different variables are they're more likely to have no access to the internet or more likely to only have received access in the last 3 years, whereas it's incredibly different to the e-cultural creators.
Exactly, and these are the kinds of things that are going to be driving, you know, the meaning that we're giving behind these clusters. So that's how we define the clusters. That's how we kind of give some interpretation and some context, is directly by looking at these input variables.
Great, wonderful. So we talked about, I suppose in this sense, we've got 2 separate aspects we're measuring. So we've got access to the internet and use of the internet, which are a little bit different, really.
Yeah, and it's important. We want to capture, you know, different aspects of, you know, we can easily do a cluster just on the infrastructure, but that would be a, you know, a clustering on internet infrastructure classification. So we want to look at not just the infrastructure and not just the demographics, but we want to get this whole mix of how the demographics in a local area are interacting with their internet, but also how, you know, what is their accessibility and prevalence of internet.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. And you know, this particular classification is quite useful for the growth of home working. And potentially we could look at how areas have changed over time as well.
Yeah, so this gives us a really nice benchmark to just look at the spatial patterns of where and how people are interacting with with the internet, and then using that as kind of like a starting point of the analysis. We're going to be able to track certain areas. We're going to see is there any kind of isolated or vulnerable specific district or areas, and that's going to be very useful for kind of things going forward: broadband speed, connectivity, and the changing workforce, of course.
Great. So we do have this data set on the CDRC Maps site. So I'll just pull that up now. And so this is an interactive mapping site. We can drag the map around. So I've zoomed in on Liverpool here. We can see that we've got the 10 different groups. So we see, in northern Liverpool, we've got quite a lot in the E withdrawn group. And then there's a much more of a mixture in central Liverpool. And so this is a really useful tool. And we have data for the whole of the UK, whole of Great Britain on here. So it's a really useful data set, and you can see lots of interesting patterns on there.
Yeah, and really comparing cities, you can see, city centers are going to be very different across different cities. So, looking at Liverpool, Manchester city centre, you can start picking up patterns of, where and how different types of workforces are behaving. So this is really interesting to kind of get this whole comparison across the UK.
And this whole comparison is quite interesting, and it's one thing I've always found quite interesting with most of these classifications is London is very different to the rest of the country. So there's a number of classifications where CDRC have done just the London classification because it's so different to the rest of the UK.
Yeah, very much so. Especially, that's cultural creators and professionals, and that's what London's known for. So.
So we're going to say look at the retail centre typology now as well. So this is a little bit different, isn't it, Jacob?
So this is same methodology. So from a methodological statistical point of view, there's really not much difference between this classification of typologies and the internet user classification of internet usage. The main difference is the data that it's being applied to and the research question in general. So in terms of the methodology, this could be considered a geodemographic or in the style of a geodemographic, but it's not applied to demography. We're applying this to kind of the built environment and retail areas around the country. So what the retail center typology is going to be looking at clustering retail areas. So not LSOAs anymore, but we're looking at kind of well-defined retail centers across the UK. And we want to look at similarities and differences in these areas based on more kind of the economic and the retail performance of these areas. So it's a bit less of the demographic, but more applying the methodology to look at the built environment.
Okay, and we have again, we also have this on the map site. And so this is, we're looking at central London now. We have kind of 5 top level groups here.
Yeah, and so these are all based on a series of input data. So the inputs that would be going into this is going to look at the type of retail that each of these centers have. So each of these boundaries that we see on the map here represent a retail center in central London now. And each of these centers are going to have a composition of types of businesses, a composition of vacancy rates, economic performance, business churn over year, kind of indices of how diverse the types of businesses are. And so using all of these as the input variables now in this scenario, we're able to come up with these 5 classifications. So these 5 kind of supergroup classifications, which are really picking up kind of the differences in terms of, high streets and tiny little more convenience areas and kind of shopping districts.
Yeah, and we use the term supergroups, and it's a kind of terminology that comes up quite a lot in geodemographics, with supergroups as the kind of top level, and then groups and sometimes subgroups if you have three separate levels.
Right. So what we wanted to do here is to kind of first, approach this in kind of an iterative fashion. So the first is to kind of get the main groupings, the main clusters. So we would apply all of the criteria and the statistical diagnostics to get our, starting baseline number of clusters, which in this case were our 5 supergroups. And then what we can do is to kind of iterate through to see if any of these supergroups have any significant subclusters within. Some may not. But in this case, you can see that a lot of them are able to have, a significant breakdown of that one group on its own.
So from the kind of practical side of actually doing the classification, you did the 5 groups first, and then took out just, say, cluster 1, and then rerun the clustering algorithm on that. Is that the gist of it?
Exactly. With a bit of diagnostic work in between, you would kind of run the full range of clusters and subclusters kind of all at the same time. But, in practice, once you select your best models, you would run the first cluster, the grand cluster, and then you would run the iterative subclustering underneath exactly.
Great, excellent. Okay, thanks. And each of these has a pen portrait as well.
Exactly. So very much like we did with the internet user classification, we can look at the data that is being used to derive these clusters or to come up with these clusters, and then try to classify or, to contextualize this data or the signature of all the inputs going into this data. So for example, in the case of the retail center typology, the data going into this is going to be based around kind of the typologies of businesses in the retail center, the diversity of businesses, the economic health, and kind of the growth of the types of businesses. So what we're going to get out of the clusters is, for every cluster, we're going to have a specific kind of combination of all these parameters, which are going to define, the types of retail centers that we have, and then the subtypes within these. So this is an example of cluster 3. So this would be kind of one of the main clusters that are a kind of comparison shopping destination. So a comparison shopping is more of the, going out to shop. So you have more family activity, browsing of different stores, walking around. And this would kind of fall in line with more of the leisure destinations. So this is going to have a certain type of retail, a certain type of businesses, a certain vacancy rate and growth, and all of that is going to be coming from the input variables.
So we have these kind of 5 top levels, and we also have pen portraits for the subclusters as well. So this is a little bit more detailed.
Yeah, exactly. So you'll be able to see kind of within the high streets, what are the different types, or, the marginally different types of, high streets or leisure centers or convenience centers.
And so once we have these kind of classifications, what do we tend to use them for the retail centers?
So the first kind of output, you're going to get the clusters, and then you just want to plot the clusters. So you're going to be able to look and see, so a lot of the data that this is underlying from is just, points of the types of retail that we have kind of spread out across the UK. And with just that points, you're not going to be able to tell too specifically about the type of retail center that it is. But we know specifically that high streets are going to be very different than small little convenience retail centers out at an urban peripheral, for example. So just plotting these clusters, we're going to be able to tell, well, here we have a fairly large cluster of retail, but it's more of a kind of a convenience, local, everyday shop type versus a more kind of, ongoing leisure, Sunday shopping type experience. And then that's going to be super important for planning, for kind of tracking the growth of high streets, tracking, as we shift into the new working from home, working from more kind of urban peripheral areas. That's going to have a huge impact on the health of high streets. So if we have a baseline classification, then we're really going to be able to kind of, track this greater, and then really, target investment, target research, target, put some context to what's going on.
Okay, great. And so, this could be a great way of measuring which clusters are impacted much more by the changes from the impact of COVID. And so we've got more, kind of retail, so leisure shopping has had a massive impact according to some of the analysis done, but generally lower impact on groceries, and that kind of matches up with what we might expect.
Yeah, exactly. And then using the typology and the map of that, we're going to be able to see, geographically where this is a potential risk area. So that's going to have impact on, residents, on the greater kind of commuting area. So understanding these kind of variations and deviations are really important.
Great. And just kind of finally, thinking about the geodemographics methodology as a whole, and these particular examples you've got here, what are the kind of limitations that we might find with this method?
So it's a limitation in the sense that you need to know, where this is applicable. So we want to kind of be clustering on observational units that we have kind of full, complete data on. So it depends on the structure and the form of the data. So for the main type of data that we're going to be using the k-means clustering on would be kind of a cross section. So we have a section of neighborhoods. That's the most common example. And then for every neighborhood, we have a series, any number of input variable. If we were looking at kind of tracking neighborhoods over time, section after section after section, there are some limitations there in terms of what the k-means can do. But there's ways to get around that using the input data. So the best part about the k-means is that the input variables is very flexible. So if you can get really creative in how you measure your local neighborhoods or the type of data that you can collect, you can input that into your clustering model and overcome a lot of these types of limitations.
It also struck me that the input data, they will date very quickly, so we can do our analysis, and the retail landscape and the internet use landscape has changed dramatically since the impact of COVID earlier this year. So would we then have to do another clustering with our updated data to see how that impacts?
It would depend on the input variables. So in the case of the internet user classification, for example, I would only update that in the case where demographic patterns have shifted or big major infrastructure changes have occurred. So as a baseline, I think it's fairly accurate. Now, obviously, if the patterns in the underlying data change substantially, then it should be updated. But in terms of new other types of data being added, then if the classification is built on kind of a sound structural, sort of a timeless, if you want to think, set of variables and input data, then it can be used in combination with tracking trajectories and more kind of sophisticated methods later on. But really having it as a benchmark is kind of the value of the model here.
One other aspect that struck me was, in some ways you could get more data, do the classification quite frequently, but it sounds like it's easy to underestimate the kind of the interpretation aspect of the process. So we saw at the very beginning with Charles Booth, he was quantitative and qualitative, but it seems easy to overlook the qualitative side.
Yeah, so that all comes to really knowing your data, the input data, understanding, what exactly you're measuring, understanding the biases that you're measuring, the limitations, how messy the data is. So I always approach anything as, input data is just very, very messy regardless. Assume that it's always going to be very messy, and measuring, the measurement might be questionable, and then try to understand where all that's coming from. And then if you address that kind of at the start of the research question, then your interpretation is a lot more confident, right? So you can look at the outputs of the results. And if you factored in your qualitative data appropriately in a quantitative way, if you kind of measured your quantity, or all the limitations with your quantitative data, then it becomes a lot easier to interpret your outputs.
Okay, wonderful. Oh, thank you very much for that, Jacob. That's a great overview of the geodemographics and the two data sets we're looking at here. Thanks everyone for listening. Do have a look at the workbook that comes with this video, where we take you through the process of reading reading these data sets into R and creating some maps. And then we also do have part 2 of the course, where we delve into the more technical side of the k-means clustering and how we actually go about creating these classifications. And do let us know if you have any comments or feedback on the course and the material as a whole. Thanks very much.